You are a better parent, and you are a better spouse, and a better friend, and a better daughter, and a better grandmother if you take that time to recharge yourself so that you have enough in your tank to give to others.
That is Kristin Maher, and I am so excited for today's conversation that we're bringing to you on the Passion Meets Purpose podcast. My name is Sarah Taylor. I'm your host, and thanks to Northwest University for sponsoring this, making it possible. So grateful for them. Now, I bet you didn't think I'm going to just go out of my way to listen to a podcast about shame today, but here you are. And not only just like shameful thoughts that we think, and maybe you're thinking you don't deal with that too much. I think we all do subconsciously, and it has been just so enlightening listening to Kristin talk about her own struggle with this, and then how she saw it reflected with her oldest, her son. Kristin is a mom of 3. My favorite thing about her is that when she couldn't find any resources to help with parenting and thoughts of shame, she created her own. She's a published author. The book is called Awfulizer. We're going to link to it in the show notes. It's one of those children's books that like you're reading it to your kid, but then all of a sudden you're feeling the tightness in your chest of, oh wow, this applies to me too. So we're going to have a great conversation today about that and several other topics. Kristin is super smart. So is her husband, singer-songwriter Matt Maher. I feel like if I ever had like actual dinner with them, I would have to like have my phone handy so I could Google a thesaurus of some of the words that they say. They're wonderful and delightful, and our conversation begins as Kristin talks about what it's like to be a new homeschooler. How's that going?
We are 4 weeks into homeschooling, and it's been very interesting. And as someone who suffers from shame, I keep looking at everyone else going, am I doing this right? I don't think I'm doing this right. Everything I'm doing is wrong. We get done pretty quickly, which technically is the benefit of homeschool, but I'm seeing that as, I'm doing it all wrong. Why are we getting done so quickly? You're not teaching your kids enough. But the kids have been really enjoying it. They miss their friends, but we try to have play dates so that they can still play with their friends. But we just wanted to have, with such an uncertain time that we're in right now versus going in and out potentially of school, we thought it might be better to have a more consistent schooling process for the beginning of the year, just so we saw how things were going. And also, because of where we are in the year, Matt's actually home. This is the longest he's ever been home for us as a family. And so he teaches like the first half of homeschool, which has been really exciting for him. And he really loves having that time to be with the kids because he missed a lot of that time being out on the road. And so it's catching up, really.
Well, we're going to actually come back to that because you recently wrote a piece about seeing some perfectionistic tendencies in your oldest. Yes. And I think a lot of us, I've got 3 kids as well, we're noticing things in our kids that we're also seeing reflected in ourselves. And it's all coming out in the dynamic of educating and being like a parent, but then a teacher. Yes. We're going to come to that in a second. But before we do, because you've written a children's book, yes. I want to get a little bit of a backstory of how that book came about, because what I love that you did was you went searching for resources in your parenting to explain the concept of shame with your son. And between you and your counselor, you couldn't find any resource. So like an awesome mom, you made your own. So why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about how that came about?
Sure. Well, I, unbeknownst to me, had suffered from shame for most of my life. Because of issues in my childhood, my grandmother raised me for a large part. She was the home caregiver while my parents were at work, and she was emotionally abusive. And so I kind of grew up with a lot of messages early on about how someone who's supposed to love me hated me and how everything was always my fault. And so it just kind of set the tone for my life for a very long time. And one day, actually having a fight with Matt, I saw how much it was affecting me and how much her voice was still inside. And so I started therapy, and that really changed my life. And I was doing individual therapy, and I was in a group of 5 other women for shame. And that's when I started to recognize, once I had been like a year or 2 in, I could hear my kids saying some stuff that I was like, oh no, those are like, I'm the worst. I'm never going to get this. I'm awful. And you think that's innocent, but the more you tell yourself those things, the more you believe them. And I was like, that is shame talk. And I do not want my kids to have to go through what I went through, my childhood and my young adult years, being controlled by this voice, this shame voice, the Awfulizer. And so I made an appointment right away with the school counselor. I was like, I think my kids are struggling with shame. I can't really find anything to help them talk about it. Is there anything you would recommend? And so she started looking and she's like, well, there's nothing that really deals with shame. Interestingly, there is stuff about perfectionism, but not shame, which can be actually an underlying cause for perfectionists. And so one day at group, we were doing a work and I was like, I'll be the awfulizer, which is what I call shame. And my therapist was like, that'd be a great name for a kid's book. And I was like, you know what? It would. I'm like, why don't I try? And so I did. And here we are.
And so The Awfulizer is a book about a little boy named James. He's 8 years old. He's on the school bus and he's thinking what?
He's remembering how he got in trouble in class and how everyone laughed at him in his class and how that made him feel. And once the Awfulizer kind of whispers into him, he starts out small and manageable, just being like, I bet everyone thinks you're really bad now. I bet they know you're a bad kid. And once you agree with that first statement, he brings up more stuff to remind you of all the ways that you've been bad and proving to you that you are awful and that you're a bad person, that everybody knows it, and that basically no one can love you because you're so dark and bad, for lack of a better term.
And then talk about how he grows, the Awfulizer grows, but there's something that eventually makes him shrink.
Right. And so the Awfulizer grows, and so as shame grows in your life, you can respond to it in a couple different ways. For James, he really shrinks. He stops raising his hand. He stops talking. He stops engaging as much. And people notice. And finally, his parents come to him and talk to him. And they're like, can you talk to us? Tell us what's going on. We've noticed you're different. And so finally, he gets all his courage. Instead of just saying, I'm fine, he actually tells his parents what's wrong and about the Awfulizer and everything he hears in his head. And he finds out that he's not the only one who hears the Awfulizer. And talking about it with his parents, it makes the Awfulizer shrink and gives him the superpower of Awesomeizer, because he's able to talk about his feelings. He's able to share what he's going through, and that gives him control and power over the Awfulizer.
Is there a story that comes to mind from a parent that was reading this to their child and they told you what it sort of unlocked in their communication?
I've been really surprised by how many people have actually started using the Awfulizer, like their kids are using it now when they're talking with their parents. I've had that comment a lot, that it's just become part of the vocabulary, where they'll be like, oh, the Awfulizer's telling me this today, and the Awfulizer's been saying that, and it just gives them a way to speak about something that maybe they didn't know how to express before. One of the things we do in group a lot is work is like role playing, and you'll use bears and things. And so having something external that you could be like, this is what's going on in my head, it sometimes really helps to make you be able to understand it a little better and communicate about it.
So great.
Thanks.
It's one of those tricky children's books where you're reading it as a parent and you're reading the words out loud and then you're internalizing a whole lot.
I've heard that as well.
In fact, your most recent blog entry that you did is other books that you consider to be great resources for talking with kids about concepts like these, which a lot of families in the middle of the year 2020, these are excellent resources. Do you want to pick one or two? We'll link below this, but what's one or two that have really helped you lately?
Oh, man, there's so many that I think are amazing. I'm trying to think of the specific ones. We just recently did one that I didn't post on there because we just really started reading it this week, but it's called Speak Up, which I think is a wonderful book. And it talks about different situations where you can speak up about things that maybe you see someone getting picked on or someone's spreading rumors about somebody and you know it's not true. And so it's great because it shows you a picture. And we kind of went through the different situations with my kids. So I'll be like, well, what do you think the person needs to be speaking up about in this situation? One is like a little girl's in a library and everybody's running around and talking and not paying attention. And so they're like, well, they're I was like, where are they? And like, they're in the library. I'm like, is this how you behave when you're in the library? And they're like, no. And so then we find out how she spoke up to be able to tell the kids, hey, that's not right. Or with the rumor one, I'm like, what do you think the rumor is that they're telling about this boy and what would you do? So it's just great to start conversations. I feel like as a parent, for me, when I go to bed at night, I have 1,000 ideas about how I'm going to talk to my kids about complicated issues. And I'm like, oh, this will be the perfect way to do it. And it's going to be amazing and so heartfelt. And then the next day comes and I forget everything, all my brilliant ideas. And so having a book to start the conversation has really helped us talk about things. Another one we did, Be Where Your Feet Are At by Julia Cook, is about mindfulness and staying present where you are, which as a homeschool parent is becoming more and more of an issue because it's easy to be distracted. Even as me, like I'm sitting here trying to teach my kids, but then I'm reaching for my phone to check at the ding and see what's happening. I'm like, no, be where your feet are. And so that's a good one for us to like kind of check each other. Like, are you where your feet are at right now? I think those are the two that we've been referencing a lot these past week.
We'll put the whole link below because every single one of these books are the tricky books where we're teaching our kids and then the whole time it's all completely applying to us.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now I will say that anytime I'm like, oh, I should talk to my kids about that, the first thing I do is I Google a book about, and there's so many you can get from the library. You can buy them. It depends on like what the topic is. Like if it's just a one time, I use the library, but some of them we just have right here in the homeschool room and we'll pull it out and be like, this is a go-to.
So with the homeschool one, another thing you've recently written about is seeing some of your tendencies. Go ahead and describe, when you say perfectionist, what do you mean behind that? Because you see the traits in your son and then you see them in yourself. And so you guys are working through that in homeschool.
Yes. So I grew up thinking a perfectionist was a good thing because that meant they were doing their best and they always went that little extra mile to make sure their stuff was perfect, not realizing there's a really kind of a darker side where when you don't get it perfect, there is a meltdown and there is a shaming voice that comes out, and there's just a complete lack of wanting to try new things because you're like, well, I'm not going to get that perfect. I can't do it right. I know I can't do it right. So I'm just not going to do it. And we've been seeing that more and more with our oldest. And so I realized I do a lot of the same things too. They have a perfectionist tend to have a difficulty with criticism. We try to remind ourselves and our children that people only criticize or give feedback when they care. If they didn't care, they wouldn't be telling you what you're doing wrong. But for a perfectionist, all they're focusing on is I did it wrong. It's not, oh, they care enough for me to be better. It's they're seeing all the things, all the mistakes I'm making. Another thing is it's an all or nothing mentality where even if they got a 99 on a test, they are freaking out about that one question they got wrong. And so the whole test is ruined for them because they got that one wrong. They can't see their achievements. All they can see is where they failed. Looking back, I did a lot of the same things. I remember crying once because I got a B on a test and my parents are like, you are so good at school. Why are you upset about this? And I'm like, I disappointed you. And they're like, you did better at school than we have ever. When have you ever asked you to get a specific grade? And I was like, no, you never have. But something in me was like, if you don't get an A, you're letting everybody down. And so that's kind of what drives perfectionists. And you can see how if you keep listening to that voice and that drive, depression can become an issue. Some people who deal with perfectionism have eating disorders, suicidal tendencies when it gets really dark. So there's a lot of negative aspects you don't necessarily associate or think about when you think perfectionist. You think, oh, that's great. They really want to get 100 on everything. But the drive there is what you kind of have to unlock and see what's behind it. And make sure when they don't get the 100, they're okay. Because the perfectionist is not.
More with Kristin Maher in just a moment about the way that we key in on what each of our kids needs. Like that's her oldest son, but then her daughter, completely differently wired. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But first, I want to thank Northwest University because they totally caught the vision of the Passion Meets Purpose podcast. And I think that makes sense since their whole goal is to offer you a faith-based community where you can grow and learn. And Northwest University's expert professors have been equipping students to be effective leaders in their fields since 1934. They offer undergraduate and graduate programs, both in person and online. The best part right now is there's a tuition freeze that's still in effect. So that means that if you're brand new at Northwest University, your tuition bill is unchanged for the entire 2021-2022 school year. In fact, Northwest University's tuition remains lower than all other Christian schools in Washington, and their low room and board rates save students thousands of dollars. They've got technology majors, like brand new state-of-the-art technology studio. It's open. Their majors include UX design, data science, video production, audio production, and computer science. Those programs add to the already diverse offering of top programs in business, nursing, education, sciences, communication, psychology, music, humanities, and more. At Northwest University, your future isn't canceled. It's just beginning. Now back to our episode with Kristin Maher. We were recently talking about her oldest son and his struggle with perfection tendencies. And now we go to her middle daughter, Rowan. Tell me, Kristin, how do you pivot on a dime to adapt to each of your individual kids, and what causes shame in their life? What's your insight on that?
A lot of it is conversation. It's kind of, most of my kids will run when they're upset. And so it's finding where they have run to and sitting there and waiting until they get to a point where they can talk about it. And sometimes they can't right away. And I'll be like, okay, I'm going to leave you alone for a little while. The big thing we try to emphasize is that it's okay to have feelings. Like, you can feel sad, you can feel angry. I'm going to let you have these feelings, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about it so they can have some time to process. But it's just consistently following up. I will say that we have noticed the perfectionist issue for about a year now. So it took me a year to figure out the timer. But it was just continually talking and listening to what is bothering them and trying to figure out, well, let's try this. Okay, if that didn't work, let's try this. And keep going back and not thinking like one conversation is the end. You have to keep following up. And even like with the timer, it's a reminder to myself as I say this, I need to follow up like next week and be like, hey, do you think this is working for you? It seems to be working, but is that what is really happening for you? And so I think the biggest thing is communication and just showing your kids that you care about what they think and care about what you feel, and that it's okay to have those feelings. Now, that being said, kind of referencing Rowan, we do have a rule that you're allowed to have feelings, but your feelings don't let you do whatever you want. So if you're feeling angry, that does not give you the right to hurt people verbally or physically, but you can be angry. So there is a line there where you're allowed to have feelings, but your feelings aren't allowed to control your actions.
If anyone wants to get some insight into Rowan, you guys post some pretty great pictures. Last night it was an Instagram video of all three of your kids singing some sort of a Broadway musical on their walk.
It was Tomorrow at the top of their lungs as we walked through the neighborhood at like 7:30. And I was like, you're welcome, everybody. You're welcome.
And that's not new. That's sort of a thing people can predict, because I think at the beginning of the quarantine, I saw a video where she had a microphone on the front porch and was serenading the neighborhood as well.
At the beginning of quarantine, she was obsessed with the musical Matilda. And so every night at roughly 5 o'clock, you could count on her to be there with a microphone and a speaker. And she would sing and act out most of the musical. She had put a paper explaining what she was doing on the tree. And her biggest issue was when people would walk away before she was finished, not realizing that they were probably going to dinner or just walking their dog. And so that was her come down moment. I'm like, well, baby, they have other things they have to do. I'm sure they loved your performance, but we have to keep walking. I mean, most people would stop and clap, but they couldn't stay for the hour-long production. That happened every night.
Oh, I love it so much. Okay. One of the other things that you wrote about, and I loved it. You talked about like taking some time for yourself each day.
Yes.
Quiet time, like your kids go have time alone, you have time alone, and how you have to really push past the desire to do the dishes or vacuum or anything productive, because you're an Enneagram 2, so you can talk about that for people that don't know what that is. And then talk about what changed, like how did you finally get to a place where you were able to do something for yourself in that half hour or hour, and then how did that benefit you moving forward?
Okay. Well, it was difficult. Enneagram 2, to reference, is someone who is a martyr and has to please everybody else before they can please themselves. So they don't see a lot of value in self and figuring out what you want. It's all about what other people want and what other people think about you. And so you're always constantly serving kind of the Martha. I always am a big fan of Martha. I'm like, go Martha, she did. I'm like, what dinner would you eat if Martha wasn't there? Also realizing that Mary played a big part, but my tune is always Team Martha. So for the longest time, the only way I could justify my me time was saying, well, by taking this time for myself, I'm a better mom and I'm a better wife. So I'm kinder to my kids and to my husband if I take a half an hour or an hour and work out or take a nap, whatever it might be, going and writing this book. I had to justify it through the lens of someone else. And I've been really working on that with therapy. And so I'm still not always 100% there, but I feel like it's gotten to the point where I'm like, it's good for me and that's good enough. And sometimes that's a harder statement to make because we're taught that that's selfish. You can't be selfish. You shouldn't think about yourself. Not realizing that our mental health is really important. And if you need to look at it in the sense that you are a better person to everybody else you encounter when you take care of yourself and you make sure you're healthy and rested, then that's what you should do. You are a better parent and you are a better spouse and a better friend and a better daughter and a better grandmother if you take that time to recharge yourself so that you have enough in your tank to give to others.
And if someone wants to read even more about that, like even some of the things, if they're like, if this is such a new concept to them and they need like bullet points on what to even do during that half an hour, you have a few that you wrote about. And so we'll link up to the blog below for that as well. So gosh, Kristin, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
You have a website, kristinmaher.com, where you write about some of the things we referenced today. And my hope is, I know you're busy doing the homeschool thing and everything, but maybe when the kids are doing free writing, I really hope that you're just leaning into that even more because I really love your voice in this space. And so I hope that you are secretly working on another children's book or something.
I have two. One I'm working on is a follow-up to the Awfulizer that deals with someone who's already had shame for a long time in their life. And then another one is about anger. So I'm kind of going back and forth between the two and then trying to find more time to like write the blogs. I will have you know that after this, I am going to write another blog because I have a new thing that I need to talk about.
This is great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And, yeah, it's just an honor to be able to talk with you today, and we really appreciate it. I hope we get to do it again soon.
Anytime. I love it. I love talking to adults. It makes me excited.
Me too. It's a highlight of the day. Grown-up conversation. If you want to find out more, like I said, with Kristin Maher, we have it all linked for you in the show notes. I think we're even doing a giveaway of the Awfulizer book, so definitely check that out as well. Our thanks to Northwest University, as always. So grateful that they're keeping this Passion Meets Purpose podcast going. And also thanks to you, not just for listening, but for your excellent feedback on some of your like wish lists of guests. I'm going after the comedians next, like Nate Bargatze, Jim Gaffigan, Michael Jr. I would love to find out more about how some of our favorite comedians that offer family-friendly, relatable humor look back on times that have been really difficult and dark and seasons of depression, and then find the laughter amidst it all, and then give those laughs to the rest of us. That's kind of where my mind has been at lately, but I'd love to know from you, who would you like on the podcast, and what your story is. Our email address for this is super easy. It's podcast@krista.net. Yeah, just email us, podcast@krista.net. Let's see, you can rate, you can review. What else did they tell me to say? We release new episodes every other week, so like every 2 weeks on Wednesdays. You probably figured that out by now. I'm just going to wrap this up. Thank you for listening. Your time is valuable. I'm glad we got to spend this part together.